Welcome to This Week in Local, a Localogy podcast featuring lively conversations about the local digital ecosystem, hosted by Localogy analysts Mike Boland and Charles Laughlin.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to This Week in Local. I'm Charles Laughlin, senior analyst at Localogy, joined by my co-host Mike Boland. Mike, how are you?
Hey, Charlie. Doing well?
Great. So, what are you working on?
Sure. So I really recently got the chance to have an analyst briefing with Howard Lerman at Ro.am. And
Okay.
some interesting things came out of that discussion. I mean, we've been talking a lot about Ro.am, so I don't want to be too repetitive with the things we've talked about in the past. But there are a few sort of new nuggets that came out of that, including some of his sales numbers that he was not afraid to disclose. So that was cool. And then also just getting a hands-on, like, I want to sort of report back some of the UX sort of elements that I thought were cool. But first of all, I said I don't want to be repetitive, but for those unfamiliar, give the quick high level. Ro.am is essentially a company that, first I'll talk about the philosophy behind it, right? I mean, we often practice form over function, as I like to say, in like just the sort of corporate standard workplace dynamic of cramming, meetings into 30-minute containers, just
Right.
it's always 30 minutes, 60. But, the actual organic time needed for a given thing, maybe 10 minutes. It might be 38 minutes,
Maybe it's 8 minutes and 38 seconds or whatever
Yeah,
the
right,
average.
right. So, but
We'll
anyway,
get
so
to that.
they put function back in the driver's seat, right? So like the meeting should be as long as it requires, not just these like, kind of arbitrary buckets we normally shove them in. And yes, you mentioned that
Something
number.
you
The
and I have
average,
always believed in, right?
yeah,
I think you and I have always been big advocates of, this is a 10-minute meeting, well, let's make it 10 minutes,
yeah.
instead of, so.
Right. So anyway, but it's hard to do that when the rest of the corporate
Right.
world operates in
Right.
these 30-minute chunks. So it's like, well, my next minute's 20 minutes away. That's not really enough time to get anything done. And like, so just
Yeah.
like everyone's going to jump at the same time. But anyway, you mentioned
Then your
eight.
job becomes meetings. Your job is
Yeah.
meetings versus what
So,
you're supposed to do. Yeah.
yeah. So given this philosophy, Ro.am has reported, I'll remind people that the average meeting time on the Ro.am platform is 8 minutes and 34 seconds as opposed to that 30-minute, so that's
Right.
some time savings. So anyway, that's the background stuff we've covered, but for those unfamiliar, hopefully that gets everyone up to speed. A couple things came out of this briefing with Howard, as I noted. I'll go over the UX elements first because he gave me a tour. I don't know if you've ever gotten the tour, Charlie, but it's kind of cool. It's
Nope.
very like, this is how I put it. It's sort of like, it's almost like a video game. And it brings this sort of like spatial orientation that aligns with the way we've been conditioned to think of workplaces as like, physical structures and floor plans and offices and conference rooms and break rooms and auditoriums. So like the UX is built around that. So for example, there are like, you look at the screen and there are floors of a building. And those floors could represent functional departments. Like that floor is the HR department and accounting. And everyone that's on the platform, sort of like a video game, resides in those like spatial constraints of either a floor or like, so you can expand a floor and you see all the people on it and you see who's in the office and their status indicators. And then in order to just have those serendipitous meetings, you simply drag your avatar to where that person is. And then all of a sudden, like they'll probably get an alert and it'll pop up and suddenly you're talking to them. And then once you're in that part, it's sort of like a Zoom call in that it's like just the boxes we're used to. But before you get to that point, that spatial orientation is very cool. It sort of tries to, this is the way I think of it. It emulates like, hey, I'm in a physical office. I'm going to walk down the hall because I got to like knock on Bob's door and ask him a quick question, right? Bob's door, the metaphor, the analog for that is essentially that status indicator. And you just sort of pop in. It's a lot of popping in. And again, that gets back to like the 8 minutes and 34 serendipitous things where we just don't get that in the sort of remote work world. So it tries to bring that back. So another cool thing I thought that maybe just sort of exemplifies that UX philosophy is that there's sort of an auditorium function. And the way it works is like you can either be in the audience, you can be backstage, or you can be on stage. And you sort of take on those roles by simply dragging yourself to that place. And then it automatically works out what you can hear and who can hear you, right? Like, so if you're backstage, the only people that can hear you, the other backstage people, just like if you were, at an event and you're backstage and the audience can't hear you yet. The second you drag yourself to the main stage spatially within the app, then everyone can hear you. If you're in the audience, you're sort of muted, but you can hear the people on stage, or you can have little sidebar discussions. So, again, the whole point here is it tries to sort of simulate the spatial orientation of physical places, and it does a very good job of it. Like they put a lot of thought into the UX. There are all these little sort of like nice touches too. Like, for example, in like baseball players can choose their walk-up music. Like you
Right.
basically choose a sound bite for whenever you like materialize into a meeting or leave, right? Howard's sound bite is naturally, for those Howard, he's a big Star Wars fan. It's like a John Williams
Mm-hmm.
like sort of like orchestral, like, I'm
Mm-hmm.
here. So, and very Howard. But anyway, there's also GPT based meeting summaries. He did a demo of me. We just kind of talked for a bit, and then he showed me the summary. Scarily accurate. So anyway, that's the UX element. I'll wind down here soon. The other thing that was cool, I teased that he mentioned some of the actual sales numbers. Ro.am already has 8,000 paid members from 390 enterprise customers, and the difference between the 390 and the 8,000 is essentially like seats, right? They're multi-seat licenses.
So each of the 390 is paying for a certain number of seats, and he
Yeah,
counts each seat as a revenue item, essentially.
yes, and the revenue item is exactly, and the volume is
Okay.
8,000. That works out to 3 paid member conversions per day, given its
Mm.
time in the market. And he wanted to emphasize, and I think it's worth emphasizing, that he did all this without any outbound marketing or paid ad spend. It's all sort of word of mouth.
Yeah.
So a lot more to say, but I'll pause there for your thoughts.
Yeah. So a few things. When he, not to put you on the spot, but did he drop any names of those 309? You said 390, right? Of those enterprises. I
Yeah,
mean,
he
is it
probably has terms of service, contractual things that he can't really talk about them. I did not ask him. I figured that was
understood? But
yeah.
I'm just wondering if if he's throwing out names like Microsoft. I'm not saying probably not
Yeah,
Microsoft,
yeah.
but
Who knows?
if
Yeah.
not, that's fine. So the other,
Well, a dollar is a dollar. A paid customer
sure,
is a
of
paid
course.
customer.
I'm just wondering
But
if that's
yeah, but you
you
bring up
know,
a good point. I mean,
yeah,
if it's like, influential companies, that's in terms of the word of mouth and
yeah.
validation.
Is he
Yeah.
throwing them around? Because that happens.
Yep. Yep.
Probably that's coming.
Mhm.
Um, anyway, the reference to video games is kind of interesting because I did a pretty short pod with Howard a while back, and he kind of led with a video game reference in the conversation. So, did you have the sense that he kind of went in to this with that framework?
I
Kind
think
of,
so. And I
yeah.
should know this, or maybe like we know a lot about Howard. I don't know if he has a background in just being a gamer, right? Like just having gaming
I
affinities,
got that
but
sense, but I don't know. Yeah,
you can see that come through. So either he or some of his product designers.
yeah.
Absolutely. And, not like, first person shooter type of really advanced, gaming,
Hmm.
but more of like sort
Yeah,
of retro gaming, that 2D overhead sort of like
yeah,
Legend of
yeah,
Zelda.
yeah.
And like, yeah, it's like that. Yeah.
Okay, okay. So the other thing that strikes me, and again, this might be a little pushback on whether this ultimately works, is I forgot where this came up at the conference somewhere about Salesforce adoption, and you and I kind of have this same frame of reference to having Salesforce and being sort of pressured to log everything into Salesforce and then never doing it.
Yeah.
So, and I know Salesforce is a much different piece of software than Rome is, but is there a is there sort of a weak point in that adoption
Option. Yeah. Like
drives
end users.
future
Yeah.
adoption, etc. If you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
In
I
other
would
words,
say,
to knock on that door, they have to be in that room, right?
yeah, yeah. I would say that, the difference between this and something like a CRM task
Yeah.
is that is like a separate pain in the ass thing that you have to stop or carve out a half an hour and go
It's
report
something
your
you
like
add to your day.
that.
It's something
Yeah.
you add to your
This
day.
is
Yeah.
more two things. This is more integrated. Like
Hmm.
it just sort of sits there alongside everything you're doing and is integrated in your, it's not like an extra task once you get used to it being
Hmm.
on. And then the second thing is I think there's a certain network effect where after a critical mass of people in the enterprise adopt it, like whatever holdouts there are, there's a certain sort of FOMO factor that pulls them in because like, hey, you missed that meeting. Oh, sorry. Like, you gotta be
Yeah.
on it, like be in the meeting. So it's like,
Right.
so I
No,
think
I
there's a
think
little
if
of
your
that.
organization becomes a quote unquote Rome organization, you kind of have to
Yeah, yeah.
have your face
But back to the
active.
first point. I think the first
Yeah.
point is stronger. It's a passive activity, whereas Salesforce,
Yeah.
like entering CRM stuff, is more of an active thing. That's a pain in the butt. This is more
Yeah.
passive. I think the barriers to adoption for end users
Yeah.
is probably lower.
And I think with all of these sort of remote tech platforms that we've been talking about, and I'm not going to name them all right now, but we've talked about quite a few of them, or as many as exist. And I'm not sure if it's going to be a growing number or a shrinking number, which will be my next point. Um, but I just, yeah, I wonder if kind of their future is converging. If if there's going to be multiple platforms, if how many different CRMs are used by every single enterprise,
Yeah, yeah.
and
There could be
yeah,
convergence or consolidation, I would say, another C word. But
I
I think
was,
here's what the
yeah,
future of this
getting
looks
at
like, I
that. Yeah.
think. Yeah, here's what the
Hmm.
future of this looks like, I think. The term platform we often throw around a lot when really we just mean
Yeah.
software, right? A
Yeah, you're right.
platform is something that others can build on because there's an API that you can tap into the functionality or an SDK where you can actually build an app that goes in an app
Hmm.
store. And that's where I believe, Howard thinks big. That's where I believe this is going, where Roam becomes a platform where there's an SDK available that you can build an add-on or a plugin or an app or whatever you want to call it that's sort of like the wellness function within Room, and it's a yoga hour every day at 4 p.m. or something like that, that like they're not going
Right.
to build internally, but they have the platform to crowdsource that innovation. And Yext,
Hmm.
Howard did this at Yext, right? They had that platform that built a Yext based app store that had all these other bits of functionality and add-on. That's where I see this going, and that's where it starts to scale into all those other functions. Um,
Yeah.
and in addition to that, this gets to your point about consolidation. Some of those other functions out there could build on this platform and be an app within the Roam
Right.
ecosystem.
What's interesting about all these platforms, and again, we had David Shim at L24. We had Howard at L23. So this has been a
Yep.
through line of our last few events. Um, they're all kind of addressing the same uh, broken sort of meeting culture.
Yep.
But they're
True.
coming at it from slightly different directions. Like you said, that they've got the GPT meeting summary.
hmm
Well, David's
His whole
business
business is
is
based
it's
on
about
that.
meeting summaries
Yeah.
pretty much.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, it's other things, but that's kind of
Not the
ultimately,
summaries, but
that's
the
the,
analytics, broadly speaking.
yeah, the
Yeah.
summary is kind of,
Part of it.
you know, yeah. But anyway, so they're all going to do versions of, it feels like a bunch of platforms kind of all starting with one thing and then all eventually doing all things.
hmm
That tells me that there's too many of them. If they're not there yet, granted, but I feel like they will be. And, so
hmm
that's kind of why I have this consolidation thought
Well,
in my head.
also the other macro factor that drives consolidation
Hmm.
and convergence, to use both of those words, is the market size. If the market
Yeah,
size wants
right.
to support all of these players, it could. But it is a potentially
Well,
massive market.
I wonder about the market size, and I think most of these folks, Howard, David, whoever, Vinny Lingham's another one, kind of sniffing around the space, is they would probably all address. They would probably answer that the TAM is every company,
Yeah.
with more than a
There's
handful of
a
employees. Yeah,
backlash to remote work now, but what Howard
yeah,
tries to do is transcend that by saying this isn't about COVID.
distributed.
This is
Yeah,
not about
yeah.
it's the distributed workforce which
I-
precedes
And I
COVID, and it's
actually
about
kind of
Fortune
agree with
500
that.
companies
Yeah,
with
yeah, yeah,
several satellite offices. It's
yeah.
not necessarily like a work from home thing. I mean,
Right.
that's tied up in it, but it's bigger.
It accommodates work from home, but it doesn't
Yeah.
require work from home.
Yeah.
And I tend to agree with Howard's basic analysis there, which is that you know we're all working in organizations that are a combination of work from home, in office 3 days a week, like
But
I like the
regardless of
joke,
that,
like
like
it's
the
like the kids
Seattle office.
taekwondo. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then there's that office that maybe is the headquarters office that the C-suite's there every day, and then there's the Berlin office where
Yeah,
God
but
only knows
you're
how
right,
often.
right.
Yeah,
Take
yeah,
take take people at home totally out of the equation
yeah,
and picture like the London office has to connect to the Seattle
yeah,
office in ways that are just more, you know,
yeah, yeah.
synchronistic. Yeah.
Okay, Mike, why don't we end it there? I mean, we could kind of rattle on about this all
Yeah.
day, but you want to read us out?
Sure. Thanks, Charlie. Thanks, everyone, for listening. This has been This Week in Local. Stay tuned every week for more episodes. You can find the show on all major podcast networks and find out more at Localogy.com. So please subscribe, like, and comment. Your engagement helps others find us. And if you're interested in being a guest or sponsor, you can email us at podcast@Localogy.com. So I'm Mike Boland with Charles Laughlin. Our producer is Dara Sweat. So thanks for listening and see you next time.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of Localogy's This Week in Local with Mike Boland and Charles Laughlin. Be sure to subscribe for more.